dirty dirt to go in around this building debris that's part of changing the skyline. Next big picture item we looked at was transuranic waste. There was renegotiation of milestone series M91 over the past couple years. And as a part of that, we got a commitment that shipments would begin going to the waste isolation pilot plant, WIP, in New Mexico in 2028. And about one shipment per week would happen between 2028 and 2035 or so. And then it would jump up to 7 to 8 shipments a week. So WIP is right now scheduled to stay open until 2050. And there's about 1,500, a low-end estimate of 1,500 cubic meters of transuranic waste covered under milestone M91. So we see that there's about 6,500 shipments if you look at the schedule for one shipment a week, and then set until 2035, and then 7 to 8 shipments a week from 2035 to 2050. Now, if you look at the size of the containers and assuming that they're all full loads, that's about 46,500 cubic meters total in those 6,500 shipments or so. So that looks good because there's only 15,000 cubic meters in M91 series, until you realize that there's also a whole bunch of non M91 transuranic wastes. Some estimates are that there's 93,000 cubic meters of transuranic waste total at Hanford that might need to go to WIP. So that's double what we have in those shipments. So that the real number of the amount of transuranic waste won't be known until you do investigations of contaminated waste sites that might have transuranics in soil. And then that contaminated material is remediated and assayed to determine whether it's has enough transuranic material to be considered as true waste. The reason that we're bringing this up now is the remediation process is not something that they can go out and start digging tomorrow for most of these sites. There's a whole set of processes and documents that have to be prepared. And conservatively here, each document's going to take 2 years to get from initialization to approval. So you've got a remedial investigation feasibility study, a work plan first, then you have to do the work for the remedial investigation feasibility study. Then there's a proposed plan, which has a public comment window associated with it. You heard today that there's some records of decision that got finalized in the past couple of years. So that's the next step after proposed plan. Then there's the remedial design work plan, which comes after the record of decision, and then the actual remediation. So you could be looking at, if you started a remedial investigation feasibility study work plan in 2024, it could be 2038 or beyond before you actually finish the remediation. It doesn't leave much time for that waste to get to WIP if WIP closes in 2050. So we have suggested that that process should start in 2024. There's not a lot of information in the 5-year plan that DOE put out about that type of investigation and remediation strategy. The third topic was tank waste, and I know Jeff is cringing right now when he sees this slide. This is my oversimplification, since I handle everything but the tank waste of the tank mission at Hanford. You've got the blue circle, which represents the 177 tanks. You've got the green circle, which represents the 18 tanks that have been emptied. The orange circle represents the tanks that have leaked. We don't think that it's important to fill the green circle with grout while the blue circle has waste in it. It's more important to spend the money to empty single shell tanks and prevent future leaks than to fill empty tanks with grout. So we say that. And then the orange circle, there's not a lot you can do right now to get waste out of tanks that are known or suspected leakers. Because in order to get waste out of tanks, you have to basically pressure wash it and vacuum it. And you don't want to pressure wash something that has a hole in the bottom, because all that water will just go down. So we want funding for PNNL or DOE to research what's known as dry mining of these tanks. So ways to get material that can't be pressure washed out of tanks safely. The other research idea that we think PNNL should pick up is the fact that remediation is a carbon-heavy process. Most of the excavators are run on diesel. You've got dump trucks and and bulldozers, and even the vitrification plant, which runs on nuclear energy and hydroelectric, has a series of diesel generators to create steam for their off-gas treatment. So Hanford has a unique mix of different contaminations. There's petroleum products, there's volatile organics, there's metals, there's radionuclides, there's some shallow contamination, there's deep contamination. It's a really great sort of sandbox for research, where if there's a breakthrough that happens, it could be of use to the rest of the environmental industry around the world, and could really make an impact on reducing carbon footprint of cleanup. So we think that it's worth having PNNL look at that type of work as well, as sort of a moonshot to try to reduce the carbon footprint of remediation. Knowing that even if the remediation is carbon intensive, it should be done because there is a moral obligation to complete the job. And so with that, that's sort of the overview of what we have in our budget letter or cleanup priorities letter this year. And Jeff and I can answer any questions.
Okay, ready for questions then.
Thanks, Tom and Jeff. This is primarily for Jeff. If you could sort of slow down a bit and maybe clear up the on-site, off-site. There's on-site making of grout and on-site disposal of grout, and then there's off-site making of grout and off-site disposal of grout. And so if there's some clarifications of what the plans, the range of plans are for those four permutations.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Dan. In the report, they looked at 20-something alternatives, and they did every combination of on-site grout with off-site disposal, on-site grout with on-site disposal, off-site grout with off-site grout with on-site. They did all of those, and they looked at, do we do it on-site in a vault or on-site in bricks in the IDF? And the four that I showed you in that chart were the ones that they felt rose to the top for one reason or another as either the most efficient, logistically the least complicated, or just for whatever reason they thought were the ones that rose to the top. And the two grout alternatives that rose to the top were off-site grouting with off-site disposal. So they would ship it, and off-site could just mean they go down the street to the Permafix facility that is in Washington State, but not on the Hanford site. And then those grout blocks are then shipped to an off-site disposal facility, or they could ship liquid tankers, 5,000 gallons per tanker and a long string on a train, and ship it to the disposal facility, because both the Utah facility and the Texas facility have on-site grouting capabilities. There's also a Permafix facility in Tennessee that sometimes gets brought into these analyses, which seems a little bit odd to go up to Tennessee and then back or down. So they didn't look at where the offsite grouting would occur, just that it would be not on the Hanford site. And they said that there are multiple options there. So that was one of them, offsite grout and offsite disposal. The second one was a hybrid where they said, we do offsite grout and offsite disposal until the year 2039. In the year 2039, we flip and we have our own grouting facility on the Hanford site, and then we dispose of that grout on site. And they, at this stage of the analysis, did not say for sure whether they imagined a giant vault like those big aspirin tablet looking things that I showed you that they use in Savannah River, or whether they do on-site disposal in the existing landfill that they've built there. I think that they would wait and see what the results of a performance assessment model show them on what's the best way to go. So the idea behind this hybrid alternative, as they called it, was you're shipping offsite sooner, one, because you don't have to build anything. The capabilities already exist. All you have to do is get it off the site, and there are existing capabilities to do that. So that's why they think they could start as early as 2027. You just have to get the permitting together. You have to figure out kind of your loadout facility. And I think they would build an evaporator because there's a lot of water when you're sluicing out a tank. And then that gives them an extra 15 to 20 years to finish doing their grout science, to try to convince the state of Washington and stakeholders like us that they should proceed with on-site grout. And then they would build an on-site grout plant, but they don't have to make those investments just yet. And that's what they say is the benefit of this hybrid alternative. Plus, you have the fallback option where if the on-site grout plan fails, well, you just keep sending it off-site. And conversely, if you get to the year 2040 and the offsite states, of which there are two options, so they're trying to manage their risk that way, that one of the states decides they'd rather not. But if both of them close, then by 2040, you have the on-site grouting capacity so that, again, you don't have to stop your waste treatment plant, which costs you time, which costs you money, which costs you risk. Did that help, Dan? Do you have any other clarifying questions, or
Yes,
anybody?
no, that cleared it up for me. Thank you.
Laura Feldman?
Yes, I wanted to go back to something that you didn't really address, Jeff, which is
Okay.
the fumes from the DFLAW facility. Crosscut came out with an article recently about ACO, acetonitril, which is hydrogen cyanide used to retreat waste before turning it into glass. And it's a big problem. It's deadly. And there's a public comment period on May 10th. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. I have started looking into it. I have not come up with a final thought on it. I did bring it up in the last Tank Waste Committee meeting of the Hanford Advisory Board, so you can find it on YouTube, and DOE gives a response. And I'm going to butcher their response here, just too full of a brain, but they were talking about how the acetonitrile gets formed based on the sugar that they put into their vitrification melter, and incomplete combustion of that sugar creates the acetonitrile, and then on down the line, and it does become a potential fume hazard in the facility where they're managing the off gas. What I recall hearing from DOE was twofold. One, that they think that they have established various controls in that facility where the analysis was put forward, that they think they've managed the risk. I'll wait and see what the reality is there. But that they're also looking at different formulations of the glass that use less sugar. And if you're using less sugar, then you're creating less of the acetonitrile. So they were open to talking about it when we talked to them. They had their answers. And it's a good reminder that I need to follow up on that and chase it just a little bit further.
Thank you. Thank you.
Justin Iverson.
So I want to build on Dan's comments, I guess, and I'm going to try and be as succinct as possible with the risk assessment. So first of all, we've had a lot of talk in past years about glass versus grout, and I saw in the table that they were both rated as excellent. So it didn't seem like there was any difference. I'm sure that wasn't the details, but it seemed like that was, and this is all coming down to risk, right? So it seemed like, okay, we're assuming they're equal, and maybe you can correct that. And then I'm confused on the off-site part and how that plays into risk assessment. Like, is that better or worse from, like, is this what's best for Hanford, or is this what's best for the US, or what's the scale of how we're assessing that risk, and how is offsite taken into account? The whole transport of liquid versus solid, I thought that liquid was pretty much a no-go, but maybe I misunderstood past discussions on that. And then we talked about environmental justice earlier in the meeting. I'm just curious if that is a component of the risk factor of, hey, we're going to move it from the historic lands of the Yakima, Nez Perce, Umatilla to some other place. And whether that's even taken into account, I don't know.
Justin, I'll try to answer your last one first. I don't recall seeing in the report specific mention of environmental justice values and factors in the decision, and maybe that's an oversight that needs to be brought forward. The perspective that I have on it is that the offsite facilities have been licensed by their host states, who have had a chance to review the long-term models, who have had the opportunity to ask for an assist from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and their modeling staff, and who have seemingly come to the determination that there are no present or future groundwater risk factors. Either the water is not potable, or it's not going to travel there in any great quantities or speed to ever be at a level that, even if you could drink the water, that it would affect anybody. And so there are these assertions where if you think about disposal context as a concept of where do these long-lived, highly mobile radioactive constituents belong, it's a fair question of whether there are environmental justice elements there, but I think that there are also geological elements to it as well, of how do we keep these constituents out of the human environment, period. To your question about the long-term effectiveness of the 4 alternatives and how they all rated excellent, I think the reason for that is because, and it is specific to Hanford when they're doing this analysis, if you're doing all offsite grout of this waste, then that's a lot of curies of technetium and iodine that just aren't in the inventory locally. And so they aren't being added to the aquifer. And similarly, the phased approach, where they would do grout offsite for the first 20 years and then on-site thereafter, they showed a figure, and I couldn't find it in the report to put in this presentation, but the amount of tech and iodine that are in that liquid that's the first 10 years is much higher, and then it's a dropping tail and then comes down here, and then this would be what's left. And so the idea being, if you can, and this is that risk budget concept, if you can reduce the total inventory that we have to keep here and that we have to trap here long term, that is de facto risk reduction, regardless of the waste form that you have for what's left. And that's the argument that they're making, and it's what we're looking at. They have not put forward an actual model that shows, well, if we put those into our model, and that's something that they would need to do before they can demonstrate that they're ready to do that. The liquid versus solid is an interesting one. We have had kind of the standard thought that why would you be transporting liquid? Is that just a silly risk of, if you have an accident, that then spills on the ground and oh my goodness. And I've been thinking about it a bit more, and let me run this by you. Once this liquid has gone through the TSCR system, it has been stripped of the gamma radiation emitters. So you could stand next to this truck and your dose would be very minimal. And therefore, if you had a liquid spill on the ground due to an accident, I would argue that your risk is greater from the actual accident than if you were a bystander and the risk from the liquid itself. That actually your risk is more of the cost of spill cleanup, because what's left in that liquid is the stuff that's a long-term groundwater risk, and you don't want it transporting in the soil of wherever it's spilled. So you got to get in there with your scoops, and you have to then, and that just becomes more expensive. On the other hand, you look at the statistical mortality risk from rail accidents, and it's like 1 in a million or 1 per million rail car miles. And when you grout a liquid, you expand its volume by 1.8. You just about double it. And so the question I have is, if you have twice as many rail cars over 42 years and your statistical mortality risk associated with that, is that actually more dangerous because you've increased the total number of trains versus if you were to transport it as liquid and the risks associated with liquid? I don't have a firm position yet, but I'm raising these questions because I want them to bring us what they think the answers are so that we can assess them. I see John raise his hand immediately when I said that.
No, just one other thing you didn't mention. So that 1.8 expansion from ground to solid, it seems like you're also paying to transport more weight, and just having more rail cars, you're going to be paying more. So I don't know if that got mentioned in the analysis or not.
Gentlemen, I have one last question for you before we break for lunch, and that is, what is your opinion on whether or not the Oregon Board should weigh in on the supplemental LAW treatment issue, the tank waste issue, and perhaps transuranic waste? And then, if so, what would our timeline be? Do we need to do that? Any of that before our next meeting, or can we work on it over the next 3 or 4 months?
If I can speak first on the National Academy study, I think that it would be probably a difficult lift to come up with comments from the board by the June 11th timeframe on this FFRDC report. However, that's not the last opportunity to make comment. There's still another year to go in the study. There would be comments, I think, in the winter, an opportunity to provide, and by the end of the study, to where if you have some reactions to what you're hearing today from me, I'm very curious to hear it, because that will help inform what I'm looking for in our comments. But as well, if this board, upon reading what we say, if people are interested in diving into the weeds on this one, feel free to talk to me or watch the videos of the meetings. And if a subcommittee wants to come up with some ideas and bring them to the board, and if you all want to make a statement, go for it. I think that it would be welcome to hear more perspectives related to community acceptance and those aspects of it. And we'd help you there. I'd say probably by the winter, and I can help you after the fact here when I see the schedule again, when the best timing would be.
How about the tank waste issue that you crystallized today?
Well, that one we're waiting to see. Department of Ecology is negotiating with DOE, among their many negotiations, on what the appropriate response is to the B109 leak specifically. And what we've heard from Ecology in the HAB meetings is that their thinking is not so different from our thinking on the board, especially as regards we need a plan. And so I think that they are going to be moving forward with some kind of agreement that they need to develop a plan. And once they then put forward something, I think that would be when this board could actually see what they have in mind for a plan and determine whether there are additional concerns that need to be addressed.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Mary Lou, can we maybe hold your question for the after lunch session with Max?
It's real quick. I just want to know if the links in the chat are going to be kept with the videos.
I believe so, Mary Lou, but I will capture, I can ask Mark if you can help me capture those before we close out anything at the end of the day to make sure we have those. And then we can, like after last meeting, just send out an email to the group with all the information that was included.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's adjourn then for lunch. We'll pick it back up at 12:31.
Very good. Thanks, everybody. Mark, are you back? Can you see my screen? I'm trying to test screen.
I can see it. It's
Okay.
not on presentation mode though.
It's a PDF. If you can see it, good enough.
Yeah, you're
Looks
good.
great.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff.
Okay, 12:30. So time to reconvene. The agenda now has Mr. Max Woods update on all the happenings since our last meeting. Max?
Well, thanks, Jeff, and thanks, members of the board. What you've seen this morning is also what's been happening since the last meeting. So as I've given these presentations before, a couple of high points here. I'll keep us on schedule. Open for questions, of course, but we'll just kind of roll in. So again, just for the record, I'm Max Woods, Assistant Director for Nuclear Safety and Emergency Prep at the Department of Energy. And I know that at the next agenda item, board business, there'll be a little more discussion here. But I want to recognize on behalf of the staff and on behalf of really the Department of Energy and all Oregonians, the folks who are cycling off the board right now. And I want to make special note and thanks to Dan Solitz, whose term actually came up for conclusion in December, but he served with us, even including right now. We have now with Ken and with Stephen coming on the board, we have replacements for Dan's spot. So Dan, really just a debt of gratitude for you. Thanks for your service. And of course, also representing this board to the Hanford Advisory Board, which is another big lift. So thank you very much for there. Who isn't here today, but people know that Jürgen Hess decided to resign from the board. That was in February or March, I believe. And I think Jürgen sent a message to the whole board. So he's not here, but in case people didn't know, Jürgen decided to resign for various purposes, and he's no longer on the board. So, but if he was listening or anybody has contact with him, I wanted to thank again him for his dedication to the board and the value he's provided to us. And finally, Brian, you're right in the middle of my screen there. Brian, your second term expired at the end of February. And again, I want to thank Brian for your service, of course, for being a part of the board today. Brian, I got to know you when you were still on the Energy Facility Siting Council. And of course, I was previously employed in that division. So many years of service to Oregon Department of Energy volunteer boards, commissions, and service to the people. So Brian, we really thank you. It's just been a great honor to be able to work with so many great people here, with you, Brian, of course, for many years. So thanks to everybody.
Thank you, Max. Thank you, Max. This has been a labor of love through quite a few years, 2 terms on the Siting Council, and then my 2 terms with the OHAB Advisory Board. And I'm going to miss all of you, and but it's really been great to be able to volunteer for everybody. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And finally, I'll make a note that Erica Elliott, who isn't here today, I don't believe, has also decided that she is not going to take a second term appointment. Her appointment, this is her first term, formally expires in June, and she notified us that she is not going to seek a second term, and that's fine. But I wanted to thank her, of course, for her support and dedication to the board. And so where that leaves us is with Ken and Stephen, new members. We have 1 vacancy. Mark, you'll have to correct me here, but I believe it would be Brian's position who will be the vacancy. We have an applicant, and I'm not going to give a spoiler alert because it's still in process right now. Those applicants have to go through the executive appointments of the governor's office. All of you, as you know, are appointed directly by the governor herself and her executive appointments team. So we have an applicant, and I'm excited about that applicant. And fingers crossed, it's approved with expediency. And then with Erica's term coming off in June, that'll leave us with another vacancy at that time. And we have another lead, another person who's expressed interest. And again, I'll keep it quiet about that. And hopefully that person does apply and is processed expediently as well. So I think we're in good shape right now. Some regular turnover and churn of the board. And just wanted to thank everybody for their service, really, and for their time they spent with us. So I'll move on to a topic I like to cover and make sure if folks have questions, they're able to answer. This one may be a little dated now, but the Oregon short legislative session concluded in March, early part of March. And I know this board focused primarily on Hanford, of course, but I'm sure there's general interest in nuclear waste, radioactive waste, policy issues of that nature. And I can report back there was no bills that were considered this session that were related to those topics, nuclear power, radioactive waste. So if there's any questions about legislative issues, certainly let me know, but nothing came up in the short session. Planning work has already begun, actually it probably began a long time ago, for the 2023 long legislative session, which will begin in the end of January, early February in 2023. I'm not currently aware of any bills necessarily that would be related to nuclear power or other issues for radioactive waste. But it's, the session obviously hasn't started yet. And so if something does come up, we'll monitor it and respond accordingly as we will. Also, just to give this board an update, as I've mentioned this before, but we're currently undergoing a rulemaking process right now through the Energy Facility Siting Council, which handles the rules for our division related to radioactive waste disposal in Oregon. What constitutes radioactive waste, how that's defined, and process for making that assessment, as well as determining whether that waste is allowable for disposal in state or whether it's not, is a rule set that's governed by FSEC, the Energy Facility Siting Council, and there's a rulemaking process underway right now that we are helping manage for FSEC. And that schedule for the rulemaking likely has us going into or through the summer before we get to the council itself for a decision on the rule package there. If there are, again, any more questions about that specifically, feel free to reach out and I'll be glad to help answer those best I can. And finally, as I often do, I want to give a plug for Oregon Department of Energy's what we call the Biennial Energy Report, or the BER for short, or just the Energy Report. Our agency releases this report every 2 years, every even year. The department is hot and heavy right now in working on the 2022 version of the BER. It'll come out in the fall. I believe it's October, November timeframe when the report is officially released. And I want to thank in particular Jeff Burright, our team, who is writing a section, or has already written the first draft of the section on radioactive waste for inclusion into that report. And so I think it's the BER in general is a great product for our agency. It's one of our showcase reports for the Department of Energy, for Oregon Department of Energy. I encourage anybody to take a look at the past report, and if you have comments or thoughts on what the next report should include, shoot me an email, and I'll put you in touch with the right people who manage that. There we go. Okay. Got a slide here that I often do about where the money comes from. I think this is interesting to you. I hope it is. It is to me. During our lunch break, our budget request for next fiscal year was submitted. I put on the slide today, and as it happened, our federal grants officers submitted our budget request to US DOE over the lunch break. What's different about this year's budget request that we put into to US DOE for our grant that funds our operations, our oversight operations, as well as provides when we travel again with this board, there's funding in that grant for travel support for the board. What's a little bit different is two things. DOE requested that we submit our application almost 2 months earlier than they usually requested. So that was a bit of a scramble on our team's part to pull that together. And they also asked for a budget request for 3 years into the future, which is also, they usually only ask for one. That's fine. We made it work. And so today we've submitted our grant request for fiscal year. And we run on the federal fiscal calendar, so it's October 1st to September 30th. So federal fiscal year 23, 24, and 25. We put in our grant request, like I said, just half an hour ago. And our, as noted on my slide here, so there are a couple things just to note here. Travel is back in. So travel in the current fiscal year 2022, as well as the second half of last year, really post-COVID or in COVID, there was no travel. Not only was allowed as a policy matter, but they didn't give us travel funding for that purpose. Travel is starting to filter back out, as perhaps many people, maybe personally in your travels for your work. As Jeff Burright mentioned, he was in Richland just last week to present to the National Academies. I took a trip last week, and many of our staff are starting to take trips. On our current grant, we have to seek acceptance to use travel funds, to seek grant funds for travel purposes right now. But if when our grant application is approved by DOE, travel will be built into that budget for the next fiscal year and the subsequent fiscal years. And who knows with COVID, never make any promises in the pandemic, but when our travel budget's back in there, it'll be easier for us to travel with the funding that'll have our support already built into that grant, including for this board. And so here is the exciting news, is to save the date around October 4th. I've pitched this to US DOE to do a tour for this board of the Hanford site. The board has traditionally done a tour. We've typically had a tour of the board members and other people who are interested on an annual basis. That hasn't happened for 2 years because of the pandemic. So I've pitched to DOE, and they have given me the tentative okay right now that October 4th will be a good date to get this board on site to Hanford to do a tour. And to, in my mind, I think would be a good idea would be to combine that with our fall board meeting. We could do it in Richland. So I was thinking there could just be the tour one day and then have a board meeting perhaps the next day. We can kind of figure out the schedule there, but I'm asking people to hold their calendars for October 4th. We'll figure out the logistics and the details there. You can tell that October 4th is 3 days into the next fiscal year, so the funding problem should be sorted out by then. And then we'll just get the logistics worked out with DOE, and they're just starting to open back up for site tours. And so I'm optimistic this will be a great thing to get this board on site, see the progress that's being made, meet some people in person, not meet your peers in person, of course, and also meet DOE personnel in person, ask all the questions we want. Mary Lou, got your hand up.
Yeah, if we're operating under a continuing resolution, is there any problem with the fact that over the last 2 years, we have not had that in our budget?
That's a good question. The continuing resolution hasn't affected I think our budget is so small compared to the federal scale that the CR really hasn't affected us as far as us getting our money and us getting paid on our grant applications. And like I said, we've been able to request variances on our current grant for some travel. And so I'm optimistic that we will be able to get funding approved for that trip in October. Now, if it doesn't happen, then I'll have to fight hard for that, to be sure. But before rolling out today, I've talked to DOE just a few weeks ago and got the tentative okay that this would be a reasonable approach for both their staff to take us on the site tour as well as funding to be able to have that. So I think we're going out a little bit on a limb here, but I'm optimistic we'll be able to do it. And considering how Congress works, I saw recently that the budget is almost never passed on time. The federal budget is it's more often than not a continuing resolution for some period of time. I think this last budget was almost 6 months, and that's perhaps a long time. But even if it's a couple of days or a few weeks, that's normal practice in DC. So we'll see.
Well, I was just thinking that because our budget has been much smaller because we had no travel in it, it might not pass.
Yeah, the difference overall in the budget, our travel budget is, I don't have it quite in front of me, 25, 30 grand a year is our estimated travel budget. So it's not insignificant, but our overall budget request, it's a very small percentage of the overall budget. So hopefully we can either find, they call vacancy savings from unspent budget in the past to fund that, or simply if the new budget's authorized, then we'll just have it built into our next fiscal year budget. We should be okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I have a slide here on general Hanford update, and I won't really belabor the point because Jeff just gave a great presentation on the National Academy study and the work that he's done to represent our agency and our state's voice in that ongoing work. And my hat's off to Jeff. He's been just working very hard to pull that together in a very short time period. I don't think Jeff made it clear, but the National Academies released their draft report, or the contractors released their draft report 2.5 weeks ago, and it's 1,000 pages or something like that. So Jeff's been poring over it to find the points, as you saw from his presentation today, which was a sort of a modified version of the one he gave last week. He's really dug into some really key points for us and brought up really important questions for us. So I really respect and thank Jeff for his great work there. We've also submitted comment letters over the last period since our last meeting. The comment that Tom Cecilia presented on the 2024 budget priorities, which of course we shared with this group when it was sent out. And we talked about this, the second bullet there, a little more extensively at last meeting, but we did formally submit our comments on the test bed initiative, waste incidental to reprocessing evaluation, which is a mouthful. And just to remember that the TBI test bed initiative is the DOE concept that they would grout 2,000 gallons of tank waste. That sounds familiar. 2,000 gallons of tank waste, grout it, send it off site for treatment and disposal at an off-site facility. And really the test bed is sort of a proof of concept of their legal and engineering ability to do so. So we submitted comments on that evaluation. And it's a long-term project for DOE. And so I don't expect that we'll have response too soon, but in time we'll get feedback there. Laura, popped up your hand there.
Yeah, first of all, thanks to all of you. You're just so wonderful to work with, really. Thank you. And consent-based interim siting from DOE. Where is that at?
That's my next slide, Laura.
Hey!
Let me roll through my point here, and then I'll get on to the next slide, and we can talk about that for a second. So my very last bullet here, the recent site tour of the WIP waste isolation pilot plant. I was lucky enough last week. I took my first work trip since the pandemic, first time on a plane since 2019. And I was lucky enough to travel down to the WIP facility in southeastern New Mexico, which is near the town of Carlsbad. I represent the state on what's called the Federal Facility Task Force, FFTF, organization run by the National Governors, or convened by the National Governors Association. And so it's a collection representation of state government agencies that have interest and responsibilities with the federal facilities, which are the DOE sites across the nation, like Hanford, of which there's a handful across our country. So I got to go down to the WIT facility, and I took a tour. I got to go underground, and it was. I know Ken has been there perhaps more than once, and I suspect people on this board, some of the folks on this board, have been there as well, 3 times. It's an incredible experience. I've never done anything like this, and if anybody has the opportunity, or we can create the opportunity, I'll advocate for it. The WIP facility is over 2,000 feet below ground. It's a salt mine, is what they do. They mine out salt. The elevator was not broken. Yeah, Tom says the elevator was not broken. I got to go down with my colleagues and with DOE. The DOE owned and operated facility. It's maybe an hour out in the desert from Carlsbad, New Mexico, kind of close to the Texas border. It's an active salt mine. They pull out salt, and then they put in what they call transuranic waste from across the complex, and it's entombed permanently forever underground in the salt cavern, and the salt just sort of over time will grow back around the waste canisters as they're put in. And Tom Cecilia touched on this just a little bit in his presentation about that milestone M091, which is the milestone to start shipping, or to ship waste called true waste, transuranic waste, from Hanford to WIP. That doesn't start until, or plan to start until 2028. Right now, they're taking waste primarily from the Idaho National Lab site, and also some waste from the Savannah River site, which is in South Carolina. So both those sites are now currently shipping waste to the WIP facility. Anyway, and I got to see the operation where they were loading up a canister and just happened to be dropping it down the elevator and putting on a forklift down into the salt caverns, and there it goes, permanently stored safely underground. The facility will operate for approximately another 30 years or so, and optimistically that'll be sufficient time and capacity to take in most of Hanford's true waste. I don't say all, because I think Tom showed a slide where there's a balance that may not be able to all get to the WIP facility. WIP operates under congressional authorization, and the maximum amount of waste that they're allowed to accept is set by Congress. And so to change that amount would take a literal act of Congress to make that change. I don't expect that would happen, but they have capacity to take in a lot of the nation's from the waste complex, from the DOE complex, most, perhaps not all, of the true waste into that facility before it's reached its capacity. Like I said, another 30 years of operating or so is what they expect until they reach capacity. Dan, you have a question?
Well, yeah, it's kind of actually too. Did they give you a sense that the timeline was based on their ability to mine the panels and fill the panels?
No, I think the timeline is simply based on how the limiting factor. There's a couple limiting factors. The mining doesn't necessarily seem to be one of them. Shipping, actually, and handling of the waste, it just takes time. Right now they get 7 to 8 shipments a week, and that's it. They have dedicated trucks that just go back, especially designed dedicated trucks that go back and forth from the waste sites, Idaho, South Carolina right now, to New Mexico. The handling on site, it just takes time for them to safely unpack, repackage the waste, lower it down, and that it seems to me that the limiting factor was really just this ability of the crew and the facility to move the waste through the system. They were expecting to ramp up to 20 to 25 shipments a week at their peak in the coming years, and right now they're doing major renovations. They had a fire in 2014 that shut down operations for a number of years, and they've been investing. I think they said they've invested over $2 billion since 2014 in upgrading the facility, including new vent shafts and new ventilation to bring air in to the underground to cycle and keep it safe for the workers. So they've been doing some major investments, and replacing the panels that they lost in that fire is a process right now, although they seem to be making good progress to be able to have space, was my impression.
Okay, and then my second concern is that the Land Withdrawal Act limits the amount of waste that can be put in there. Like you said, that Congress has to change that. And there are a lot of there are a lot of other folks out there that are that will have waste to go into there by 2050, and some of it takes precedent over our waste. The waste from refurbishing the nuclear weapons, for one, and probably what's going on in the New Mexico weapons part two. So, is there any chance of us getting all of our waste? And the amount of waste I'm talked about is over half the Land Withdrawal Act capacity. So, I'm not as optimistic as you are about getting as much waste in there as we can.
Yeah, those are good questions. Right now, the state of Idaho has from the Idaho National Labs by the state of Idaho has priority, and that was an agreement that apparently the state of Idaho reached in the 90s with USDA to prioritize their shipments of waste. So good for them to be able to do so, but it's at the expense of the rest of the complex. So right now they're prioritizing Idaho. Like I said, I'll take South Carolina waste. Yeah, and I mean it's a good question, right? It's a sort of a discussion.